let folks trickle in for maybe one. Sophie Egan, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the co-director of the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative. Delighted to welcome you to our first webinar of 2019. We tend to offer these roughly on a quarterly basis, and we call them virtual lunch and learn or latte and learn. That, of course, all depends on your time zone. Anyone international, maybe that's more of a midnight snack. In any case, we're delighted to have such great turnout today. You're in for a real treat, or I should say, at the very least, a great amount of knowledge to be imparted, as we have Rich Waite, who is a research collaborator. This is a really fantastic type of role that we launched earlier this fall. World Resources Institute is one of our first research collaborators, and we're fortunate to have Rich serving as really an exceptional partner in our Collective Impact Initiative. So this webinar is a little bit different format from some of our previous webinars where we focused on a specific principle, or on our most recent one, we heard from the Education Working Group, some of the great resources that they had been crowdsourcing. And today we're just doing a real deep dive into this Collective Impact Initiative, and specifically the data analysis that Rich has done along with Jackie Bertoldo from Stanford. So you'll hear from them in a moment, but in short, the reason for this webinar is to answer questions. We first and foremost also are very grateful to all of you who have contributed data to this initiative. For those of you who aren't as familiar with it, you'll also get a little bit of a primer on the initiative, on what this sort of goal here around collective impact is. And then you'll hear from Jackie towards the end in terms of what's ahead. We also wanted to give you a chance to hear from Rich, as you can see on the title here, Greenhouse Gases in Food, kind of how the social math, the translation of our aggregated data came about. For those of you who were at the October meeting of MCURC held at Princeton, that was the first time we shared some of this preliminary data with you, and there were, of course, lots of questions. Many of you want to dig into it a bit more deeply, so that's what we're going to do today. And one thing I want to share just excuse me, at the outset is that this initiative is now rounding towards the end of our first year of this phase one. So phase one has focused on the protein portfolio, and the first year, which will end at the beginning of March, is really about collecting benchmark or baseline data so that we can measure progress, hopefully in the right direction, going forward. And with that, we also have not been very public about this effort. So just wanted to give a friendly reminder to those of you on this call or on this webinar that this is, at this point, an internal story. This is internal material that we're sharing. We won't be sending the slides afterward. We do have a YouTube channel with all of our videos from our webinars. And so this is really for and by the MCURC community. That, of course, includes members who are submitting data, and then absolutely our sponsor representatives who may also be really excited about the huge potential of this collective impact concept, not only in terms of our protein purchases, which, as I mentioned, is this first phase, but as Jackie will describe as well, sort of some of the additional opportunities that lie ahead of us as we get further along. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rich, and actually, Dara, do we have the slide that just has the collective impact?
That's not the whole people movement. That's the one trying to crack the bad. Sorry,
I muted them. What was the question?
There's a slide that has just the collective impacts overview. I'm not sure if that's Rich's first slide. I don't think that it is.
Jackie will show that.
Okay, great. So without further ado, then I will turn it over to Rich. Just as background, he is an associate in World Resources Institute's food program. He has authored several really pivotal reports, gotten huge media attention related to shifting diets, as well as aquaculture, He can tell you more about some of the other initiatives that he works on that are very complementary to our work, namely the Better Buying Lab. And all in all, he just brings an incredible amount of expertise to this task. He has a master's in international development studies with concentrations in environment and food security. He's based in Washington, D.C., and as I said, he's just been a phenomenal partner in this whole effort. He will turn it over to Jackie Bertoldo. Many of you know Jackie is Assistant Director of Food Choice Architecture at R&DE Stanford Dining. She is instrumental as one of the leaders of MCURC, but in her role there, she is the kind of lead nutrition and behavior change expert for Stanford Dining overall. She also works with the Better Buying Lab effort and really works with the different culinary and sustainability teams to translate evidence into innovative food and educational programs for the whole Stanford community. She's also been really instrumental in a lot of the MCURC research. She also holds many degrees and is very qualified to be working with Rich on this effort, including an MPH and a degree in exercise science. So, and she's a registered dietitian, I should say, which is, again, very complementary to Rich's sustainability expertise, and we'll dig into that a bit more. Rich, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks everyone for being with us today. Just for those of you who don't know about WRI, we are a global research organization working to move human society towards sustainability. And our food program advances solutions to sustainably feed 10 billion people by 2050. So one important solution is a shift towards more healthy and sustainable diets. And we've been working in this area on the Better Buying Lab since 2016. And we were really thrilled when Eric and Sophie invited us to collaborate on the Collective Impact Initiative, because we've been taking a pretty close look at the potential of environmental benefits of large-scale diet shifts and sort of the necessary level of ambition. So there's a few questions that I'm going to try to answer over the next 20 minutes. If you were with us at the MCURC meeting in Princeton in October, the second half of it is going to be quite similar to what I shared. But Eric and Sophie wanted me to take a step back for this webinar to talk a little bit more about the bigger picture and why these sustainability issues are so important. So I'm going to talk about why do we care about sustainability in the global food system, and sort of what are some of the big challenges and solutions, how can we measure progress, and then the second half is going to be about, well, what do we know about MCURC's collective impact given that first round of data collection, and what insights are emerging, and then end on, well, what are some other things that we could be looking at now that we're starting to have this really interesting data in hand. So we just released in December this major new report called Creating a Sustainable Food Future, and it's basically starts from the premise that looking out to the year 2050, we're expecting nearly 10 billion people on the planet, and what that's going to create a pretty big food gap. Looking back to 2010 as a base year, we estimate that the world food supply is going to have to be about 56% larger in order to feed everyone at expected levels of demand. And this is really because of not only population growth, but also income growth across the developing world, adding 3 billion people to the global middle class, and people eating more varied and more resource-intensive diets. I will note that we're already in the year 2019, so the real number looking at to 2050 is probably in the 40s instead of the 50s, but overall the story is the same. The world is going to need quite a bit more food than is available today. So one big sustainability challenge with that is that we're going to need to produce a lot more food without further expanding agricultural land. Agricultural land expansion historically and currently is the leading driver of deforestation and biodiversity loss. This is a big issue in the tropics today. Unfortunately, we're seeing tropical deforestation going up rather than down, even though the world is already making some pretty big efforts to try to stop it. And then deforestation in turn also fuels climate change. So we project, looking out to the year 2050 under sort of business as usual growth, that agriculture is going to expand by another 600 million hectares into the world's forests. Just to give you a sense of that, 600 million hectares is nearly twice the size of India. So that's a huge amount of further of future deforestation unless we can get a handle on it. Another big challenge from a sustainability perspective is that we're going to have to be, just as we're expanding the global food supply, we're going to have to be reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by about 2/3 between 2010 and 2050. Agriculture today, you can see the bar on the left-hand side, accounts for about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions if you count emissions from agricultural production and also land use change, deforestation. Looking out to the year 2050, we project that those emissions could grow from about 12 gigatons to about 15 gigatons, which is a big problem considering that the world has to be moving drastically in the other direction. So climate scientists tell us that to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to have to hold emissions from all sectors below 21 gigatons by 2050. To hold warming to less than 1.5 degrees, it's going to have to be even lower than that. So if agriculture is already taking up 15 gigatons, that's the majority of total allowable emissions. It's basically would render holding warming to those lower levels basically impossible. So challenges are big. I haven't even gotten into the water challenges, but that's a big challenge too. But luckily, the menu of things that we can do, am I muted? No, is also broader than commonly appreciated. So we, in this new report, took a pretty close look at more than 20 of these different solutions that the world can implement, looking all the way from farm to fork. And you know, for those of us on the line who are dining providers, some of the most relevant solutions are going to be in those reds about reducing growth and demand for food for food, and that's namely reducing food waste and shifting high meat diets towards plants. So you know, the protein flip is definitely on the menu, and as you can see, that shifting diets bar is pretty big, and that's because we're looking at less emissions from livestock production. So, you know, think of like methane from cow burps, for example, but also a lot of avoided deforestation because meat production takes up a really large amount of land. But looking across the whole menu, the greens and the purples and the blues, there's a lot that can be done to improve agriculture, make it more climate smart, boost its productivity, whether it's of crops or of livestock or of fish, improve its environmental performance. And then the light greens all the way on the right-hand side are about protecting and restoring natural ecosystems, you know, namely things like forests, putting trees back in some places where they existed before. And so the world really has to be doing all of this all at once. So there is a path to sustainably feed 10 billion people, but it's difficult, and you know, and we need to really ramp up action. So to the point of shifting diets, just a little bit of background on its potential. So shifting from meat towards plants can reduce impacts, and you can look at this in a couple ways. One is by looking at the level of individual foods and looking at environmental impacts across different food types. And so you can see this graph is showing land use in green and greenhouse gas emissions in orange per million calories. And you can see there's kind of 3 different food types here. All the way at the bottom, you have meat from ruminant animals, so beef, lamb, and goats, which are by far the most land intensive and greenhouse gas intensive foods. Then in the middle, you have all the other meats, dairy, fish, and eggs. And then at the top, you have a lot of the plant-based foods. A lot of this is just because of the fundamental reason that animals need to first eat plants, so you have this inefficiency. And so, you know, so the world right now, the global diet is shifting from the foods on the top towards the foods on the bottom. And in places like the US, where we're consuming a lot of the foods on the bottom, shifting back towards the foods on the top can greatly reduce the agricultural system's environmental impacts. So you can look at the level of individual foods, and you can also look at the level of entire diets. So we looked at a number of different alternative diets, and there's a few ways to think about this. One, you could think of just the average person here in the US. or you could think of the average dining facility in the US, or you could think of the entire US. But basically, what this is showing is that for the average person or average dining facility, if we were to move towards a Mediterranean diet, it would reduce land use and greenhouse gas emissions related to our diets by about 11%. If looking all the way over on the right-hand side, if everyone went vegetarian, it would reduce impacts by about half. If everyone went vegan, it would be even more, probably 70% or more. But since such a small population is vegetarian and vegan, I think it's about 5% in the US right now, we think that some of the most interesting scenarios are the ones in the middle, where we're shifting from meat toward plants, but people are still able to eat, you know, the whole range of foods that they enjoy. So, for example, the 3 bars in the middle there show a few different scenarios if the world shifted from beef towards pork and poultry or towards legumes, and just reducing that one food in the diet can cause impacts to decrease by between 13 and 35%. Over near the right-hand side, we also have a scenario where all animal proteins are shifted towards plant proteins. So all animal proteins are reduced by half, shifted towards plant proteins, and you can see it reduces impacts by nearly half. So these are really, really big potential impacts, and they don't necessarily need to mean, you know, huge shifts in lifestyle. So I guess one other point is that there are a lot of environment and health win-wins, and I think Jackie might get to this too, but we looked at this primarily from the environmental lens, and that's our report on the left, Creating a Sustainable Food Future. You might have seen just last week, the Eat Lancet Commission report was released, this report on food, planet, and health, and they took a much, much deeper look at the nutrition through a nutritional lens. And the interesting thing is, they came out with a lot of very similar solutions. We have to sustainably intensify agriculture, we have to reduce food waste, and we have to shift diets. And the diet shifts that they recommended were even bigger than the ones that we recommended. But again, it's a lot of, you know, shifting high meat diets towards plants. I should mention that the environment and health win-wins aren't automatic. You know, you can think, since meat and dairy do have a lot of nutritional qualities, there are diets that are very high impact that are also perfectly good for you. And then on the flip side, if everyone, you know, if people shifted from meat to candy bars, for example, okay, that's pretty good for the environment, but terrible for your health. So there's a lot of potential win-wins in there, but they're not automatic. So one thing that's really good from, you know, for what we're trying to do here in the Collective Impact initiative is that the data, the environmental data out there is improving, and it's getting much easier and cheaper to be able to set goals and to be able to track progress, because every year more and more studies are being released that have, you know, publicly available data on whether it's greenhouse gas emissions of different foods, or land use, or water pollution. So we have a global food and greenhouse gas model, but we've also been looking across some of these really, really detailed data sets, like the one here on the screen. This is a 2017 data set that we actually used for the this first phase of the Collective Impact environmental analysis. But one thing that we're doing is looking across all these different data sets and thinking about how we can use this data to make a user-friendly calculator that, you know, would allow a user to plug in their food purchasing data and then, you know, instantly analyze the greenhouse gas emissions or the other environmental effects. So that brings us to the MCURC data. And so, you know, first off, like Sophie said, thanks again to the 27 colleges and universities who provided data on this first round. Just over 6 months, we captured we captured almost 30 million pounds of food purchases. And this data allows us to do some really interesting analysis and also do some look out into the future and look at some different scenarios. So we collected data on all of the major animal proteins: meats, dairy, eggs, and seafood, along with legumes, nuts, seeds, and grains. And collectively, these foods account for about 90% of the protein in the US diet. And so you can see the breakdown here. I'll just mention that dairy looks kind of high because it's a mixture of milk and cheese, and milk has a lot of water in it. If you were to look at it in terms of protein, dairy would look a little bit smaller. So this is what the analysis of the data looks like. It's actually pretty simple analysis. The hard part is collecting the data. So you can see basically what the analysis is it's multiplying the different amounts of food purchased by the different greenhouse gas emissions factors to estimate greenhouse gas emissions associated with each food and then totaling it up. So you can see beef, for example, the MCURC collectively purchased about 2 million pounds of beef in those 6 months, which contributed about 55 million pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent to the atmosphere. A couple things I should point out. The emissions are, it's mostly the emissions from agricultural production, and there's a small amount of transport emissions to regional distribution center. It doesn't get into the question of food miles, and that's mostly because if you were to put food miles into it, it's actually just a small piece of the puzzle. The bulk of emissions from the food system happen on the farm or before the farm. And I should also mention that these emissions don't include these emissions estimates don't include emissions from land use change, which is a big part of the puzzle. And so we're going to be adding that capability in the future, but I should just, this is just to say that 136 million pounds of emissions, it's a conservative estimate. So this is a more kind of user-friendly way to look at the data, and you can compare the food purchasing weights on the left to the, it should say greenhouse gas emissions on the pie on the right, but you can see that there's a few insights that come out of this. So for example, the greenhouse gas pie on the right, you can see that 97% of the emissions came from the animal proteins and only 3% came from the plant proteins. So that, that kind of underscores that, shifting further from animal proteins toward plant proteins would cause the greenhouse gas emissions to go down. Beef in particular was a high contributor to emissions. So you can see the pie chart on the left. Beef is about 7% of the food purchase weight, but it accounted for 41% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So that suggests a particularly powerful way to improve our impact in the future is to implement the menus of change principle of less red meat, less often. And by tracking these protein foods, we've probably captured 90% of the true greenhouse gas footprint of your food purchases. We didn't look at things like fruits and vegetables or vegetable oils or sugars, but these are lower impact foods that probably would contribute only 10% or so. So this is sort of the data that you've provided is sort of a nice sweet spot in that it's a limited amount of foods that you've tracked, but we've captured the vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions. Another interesting comparison that we can do with the MCURC data is to compare the proportion of the different proteins to the US national diet. I cut the dairy out and the grains out because it got a little tricky when I was trying to do this, but if you look, just looking across these 4 protein types, you can see that in comparison to the US national diet, which is in the hatched bars, MCURC dining facilities are serving less red meat and more white meat, and also more legumes, nuts, and seeds. So this kind of, it suggests that some of the menus of change principles are already being implemented, and it would be interesting to if there were data from 3, 4, 5 years ago, I suspect that the bars would be sort of similar, the MCURC bars and the US national diet bars. It gives you a sense of the kinds of change that can happen relatively quickly. And I should also mention that because of this shift away from red meat towards white meat, towards legumes, nuts, and seeds, that the emissions per pound of food, if you compare the MCURC data to the US national data, the MCURC, the emissions related to what was served at MCURC universities are 22% lower per pound of food than the US national diet. So again, suggesting that, sort of big change is possible. So you might remember at the very beginning of this, I talked about the need for the global food system to reduce emissions by 2/3 by 2050. So at WRI, we have the saying that in order to hit big environmental targets, like holding global warming below 2 degrees, we need to think about going from just doing better to actually doing it enough. So then the question is, what does enough look like? So we have this global target. If the whole food system were to reduce emissions by 2/3 by 2050, we'd be on track for holding global warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees. And the interesting thing is that the collective power of large food purchasers can play a big role in helping make this happen. So imagine a hypothetical goal of reducing food system emissions by 25% by 2030, which, as you can see from this graph, would put us on the glide path towards reducing emissions by 67% by 2050. And then the question is, could implementing the menus of change principles get us there? Could MCURC collectively reduce its food-related emissions by 25% by 2030? And so we played around with some sample purchasing scenarios looking out to the year 2030. And so here's one of them. So basically what we did here was we took the 6-month baseline data that you provided, expanded it out to a full year, and then played around with the proportions of the food. And did so in line with menus of change principles. So you can compare this hypothetical 2015 bar to this hypothetical 2030 bar on the right. So for example, you can see with the green, we've moved legumes and nuts to the center of the plate. I think it's like tripled. We're making whole intact grains the new norm. The amount of grains is slightly increased, serving more kinds of seafood more often. The amount of seafood, I think, is up by 50 to 100%. Dairy, poultry, and eggs in moderation, so those are slightly reduced, and then serving less red meat less often. I think we reduced beef and lamb purchases by 40% in this scenario between 2015 and 2030. So if you run that through the same greenhouse gas calculator, you can see that that scenario would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food that MCURC is purchasing by 25%. So and that's a reduction of more than 100 million pounds of CO2 equivalent each year by 2030. And there's multiple pathways to do this. I should emphasize that that's just one scenario to get you there. So this is exciting. It means that big, meaningful reductions are possible and are definitely in line with the menus of change principles that you all are already implementing. So here I'll also add a short plug for a new initiative that WRI and partners launched at the Global Climate Action Summit in September, and it's called the Cool Food Pledge. And it's this new commitment platform that helps companies, universities, hospitals, and other major food providers serve delicious food while collectively reducing their food-related greenhouse gas emissions by 25%. So just as we're doing here, we're going to be helping pledge signatories track the climate impact of the food they serve over time, and then promote their achievements as leaders in this growing movement towards healthy and sustainable diets. So we have 11 signatories so far, including one here on the webinar, UCSF Health. So if you're interested in your institution going the extra mile and making a public pledge towards this collective greenhouse gas target, please email me afterwards. So, oh no. My bullets have disappeared. But what I wanted to say here was that, so we have this first phase of data collection. We've run an initial GHG analysis, but there's so much more that we can do with this really powerful food purchasing data that you all are gathering. We can run, we could look at land use over time, we could look at water use or water pollution over time, we could look at trends over time, we can do some more scenario analysis looking 5, 10, 15 years out into the future. We can also look at nutritional analysis, seeing how, seeing how the mix changes over time. So this data is potentially very powerful. So I hope that I've answered some of these questions over the last 20 minutes. Feeding 10 billion people within environmental limits is going to be a big challenge, but solutions are out there, and this shift towards healthy and sustainable diets is one of the important solutions. It's easier and cheaper than ever to find good environmental data to be able to track trends and to set targets. We already know quite a bit now about MCURC's collective impact and its protein portfolio, how it compares to the US average, where some of the greenhouse gas hotspots are. And then there's a lot we can do looking out into the future, whether we're looking at other environmental impacts like land and water, where we're looking at nutrition, where we're running scenarios in the future. And so I'll end it there and turn it over to Jackie, and then really interested to take your questions.
Thank you, Rich. I think I need you to, hold on.
Stop share?
Yeah, stop share, please. Okay. Thank you, Rich, again, for the segue into an update on the MCURC collective impact. So as Rich has mentioned, there's a lot of work that's been done, and we're really eager to look at how we can continue to collect this data and utilize it to make real shifts in terms of our protein portfolio purchases. So just a quick reminder, I think this is a slide that Sophie was referencing at the beginning of the presentation, just a reminder of what our intention is behind the MCURC Collective Impact Initiative. So it's a strategic initiative of data collection and analysis that really intends to empower its members to enhance their understanding of our collaborative's combined protein purchases. And as Rich has so beautifully represented, our purchases have an effect on the global environment and also on the health of our students. We want to make sure this data is aggregated so that our members' ability to enhance these efforts is exponentially increased beyond that of a single university. And once fully understood, we want to look also at the most effective strategies for reaching our goals and sharing those and scaling those more broadly. So where we've been, we began in June of 2017 with a small pilot with 7 universities, and we had 3 indicators. We then expanded that to 5 indicators and 28 universities submitting data. And we also solicited feedback and input from our members on what metrics and indicators were most important to them. And also with our research partners, and WRI was instrumental in identifying what is the most essential data that we can collect to not overburden our members in terms of the amount that they need to, of data that they need to collect, but enough that it will give us a substantial insight into our greenhouse gas emissions and other collective impact measures. So most recently, we had 12 indicators that were extended to all MCURC members. We had 27 universities submitting their data. And as Rich mentioned, 30 million pounds of food was really just a tremendous effort, and I think an indicator of just how important this initiative is within the MCURC. And so that data collection was for 6 months, the first 6 months of 2018. Going forward, we've determined that we are going to collect data biannually in January, for January and for July. So I'll go into that real quickly. So a lot of you are probably wondering, when do we submit our data? And I will be sharing a guide for submitting data tomorrow, but I just want to assure all of you that we have not changed the metrics. And so data collection will be, the metrics that you will be submitting for data collection are the same as what you submitted back in the summer for the first half of 2018. So data collection, the next round of data collection is for July 1st through December 31st, 2018. And we've set a deadline of March 1st, 2019 to receive that data from all of the institutions. And I am the contact person that you can reach out to if you have any questions. Quickly, I would just like to show you a couple of the things that I'll be sending out. So this is the guide. Again, it's not much has changed from the last time we sent this out. I do just want to point to a couple things. We've identified the MCURC collective impact metrics here. And so it goes into some examples of what each of the metrics encompasses. And then if I scroll down here, there is a collective impact FAQ, and that is going to be, the FAQ is going to be really important for all of you who have very specific questions around whether we should count bone-in versus boneless meat, what we should do for mixed foods that have some meat but some other products. There are suggestions, and we have kind of a tiered approach to what would be ideal, but we don't want to, again, overburden our members with data analysis. And so if it's not practical for you to separate bone-in versus boneless, we have some alternative suggestions of ways you could provide us with the best data possible. So I also wanted to share, there have been many requests for a template for how data could be submitted. So this is one example that I'll be sharing as a way that you can submit your data to us so that we have more consistency in how the data is submitted. And with that, come back. Okay, so that's where we are right now. We're about to launch the second phase of data collection for our first year. And our intention is to analyze that data to create a collective impact analysis very similar to what Rich shared for those first 6 months for the entire year of 2018 to determine a baseline from which we can then analyze scenarios for improving our collective impact. And what we'd like to do is set a series of possible collective targets, acknowledging the differences within different institutions, what is realistic. We want to meet everybody where they are and help them move the needle towards healthier, more sustainable purchasing. But we want to make sure that we have a tiered approach so that we're able to acknowledge all of the differences within the universities as well. And then beyond that, we want to develop research projects, best practices, and tools to move towards achieving one or more of our collective targets. And so that's going to be really important to leverage the infrastructure that we've built around the research working group and the education working group, as well as all of the committees, to see how we can collectively work together to drive us towards these targets. And with that, I think we are going to hand it over to Sophie for questions.
Great, thank you both so much. And really, this collective impact initiative would not be possible without Jackie and Rich, as well as Dara along the way. So just very grateful and hope that this has answered many of the questions that maybe have come up since the October meeting or in the past couple of months, but would love to use the remaining time to field all of your questions regarding really anything that that Jackie or Rich has shared with respect to the kind of what's ahead, the data collection piece, and some of the sources that Rich shared as far as how he's getting some of these numbers and what this all translates into. You can, let's see, I think maybe if you can chat, Dara can unmute you, or you can just try unmuting yourself, which should work, I think, at this point. So if anyone's feeling shy, I know one of the questions that came up in October was around, Rich, you talked briefly about, let's see, I'm not sure if you can see that, Rich, but there's a question from Trevor. Is there a benefit to measuring impact as a function of calories instead of pounds? So Jackie or Rich, do you want to speak to kind of why we chose to go with pounds?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is. I mean, I kind of alluded to that when I showed that first pie chart, and the dairy was really big because it's mostly made up out of water. So I think it's helpful to measure it's helpful to show also the protein portfolio as calories and also impacts. You can look at it by calories instead of pounds. We've done everything in pounds so far just because it's easier to get the data in pounds than it is to get the data in calories. But one thing that we're thinking about adding is just some conversion factors in the calculator. So you could, once all the data is there, you could use some averages, calories per pound of beef, calories per pound of beans, whatever, to be able to kind of get the metric that you're looking for, whether you want to do it in calories or pounds.
Great, and looks like Lily.
Hi there, this is Allison from the University of Maryland.
Hi, go ahead, Allison.
So I was a little bit late to join the call, so I'm sorry if this already was covered. But one question that came up with our team and sort of looking at and preparing for the collective impact data request for this past semester, we've also been thinking about kind of looking back a couple of years to sort of see trends over time. And I was wondering, is there any discussion on adjusting for any growth in the program? Number of students on a meal plan or number of transactions. Is there any advice about how to do that? Considering we've seen quite a lot of growth over the past 3 years, and when we're looking at these numbers, want to make sure that we are somehow adjusting for that, or is that not recommended?
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is, I think, a fairly common question. I'm not sure. Rich, looks like you can handle that.
Sure, I'll take a cut at it, and I know Jackie might have something else to say too. But absolutely. I think so. So the main metrics that we've been looking at are overall greenhouse gas emissions, but then greenhouse gas emissions per pound of food. But then also, if the institution has it, greenhouse gas emissions per meal or per card swipe or per cover or whatever that denominator is also really helpful. So I think one of the challenges has been that I think different institutions have different denominators, and there was no one standard thing. But I forget, Jackie, if that's something that you asked for as an optional, like number of meals or number of covers, because I think it's important to be able to look at both over time.
Yes. Dara and I are sharing an office, so that's why you keep hearing the echo. Yes, I think that one of the things that we discussed in this is a great point that you're making. We also want to make sure, as I mentioned, that we meet you where you're at. And different universities are in different places in terms of their menu initiatives. Some universities are growing more than others, and so this is why we want to create tiered targets that really allow for that flexibility and don't penalize members who maybe are just growing their student body and serving more meals for their success in that area. But what we're hoping is when we look at it collectively, those things will balance out in terms of our collective goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Right, so absolutely not intending to, and we have ways with, so I think one of the things I mentioned just for context is this is really our first year of just establishing the baseline, right, of even, can we, collect data together in a standardized manner? Can we translate that into some meaningful storylines, if you will, for lack of a better term? Social math is one way people talk about this, but it's really what does this equate to in terms of good in the world for our students, for the environment, and we really established that we can, and thanks to the hard work of all of you. And now going forward, as we track progress over time, you're going to be seeing some additional tools, some additional sort of aspirational series of targets, as Jackie mentioned. And with that, we absolutely have ways of ensuring that we're not being penalized as a group for the fact that the student body overall may be growing. So I think if I'm hearing, sort of reading between the lines between Jackie and Rich, it's even though it may not be something that you're specifying in the form where you actually submit the data, we can account for that. But perhaps it's the kind of thing that when you have your one-on-one exchange around submitting your actual data, that this can become more clear. Sorry, that's a little bit too complicated.
I mean, one approach to it, I think that, it's sort of brainstorming in real time, but if along with all of the pounds of different foods, if there was also an option at the end to say, and what's your, is it how many meals or is it how many card swipes, like to track that every 6 months also, that would at least at an institutional level, you could see how the greenhouse gas emissions per meal or per card swipe evolves over time. Yeah, even though it might be difficult to aggregate that up if there's a different measure.
Well, and this is where I think the one other piece that comes in here is you may, all of you may be aware that we ask for annual updates of your member profile to go on our website. And that's actually where we typically are receiving from you information that your meal plans have grown, that your undergraduate or graduate population has grown. And so essentially what we've been planning to do is use those annual reports from all of you in terms of what your total populations are. So I think that's just maybe a plug to keep in mind that those are important. And so although they may not have been attached to the submission of your data, we are using each of your public-facing member profiles on our website, which have those numbers. So it's number of, I believe it's total meals per day. So just keep that in mind when you hear from Shannon Muntz for those updates, and we can obviously go back historically and ensure that they're accurate.
Quickly, just one more point. Adam actually made this on the group chat, that another thing to consider is when we're looking at the protein portfolio, we're looking at ratios. And so you're looking at the proportion of your purchases that are, beef versus chicken versus nuts, legumes. And so even as you are increasing the amount of food that you're buying, you can still be working on shifting the proportions of food that you're buying, which would account for the growth in the program.
Right, sorry. And so what I was addressing was just to your own institution's ability to track your own progress, which again is something that we understand many of you wish to do with sort of some of the guidance of Jackie and Rich as you submit this data. But absolutely to the point of the proportions, and for sure in the aggregate as a collaborative, because it is really about, that's what the protein flip in general is all about, is ratios and emphasis and improvement overall in that mix. So other questions we have about a little under 15 minutes remaining.
This is Allison one more time. I have another one came up from the team. We've been talking a lot about this. So don't want to be a hog on the questions, but but one thing that came up for us, and I'm sure you guys talked about it before I jumped on the call, but one thing that did come up in our conversations is about that proportionality. We had some conversations about having, much more focus on vegetables on the menu, and I know that that's not being tracked because of kind of how complicated that may be, and maybe it's not the driver of the climate impact, but I do think that kind of not having the vegetables represented, when we were looking at some of our numbers comparing, it maybe left a little bit of the picture out. So I don't know if there's any kind of other folks have felt that way also when you're looking at it as kind of your own institution, or if there is any worth in looking at the vegetable consumption or purchasing.
I can jump in on this unless Jackie or Rich wants to. I'm not seeing anyone meeting themselves. So we, in the second round of the first year of collection, we did update which foods specifically we kind of designated as part of the protein portfolio, thanks to great feedback from all of you, but did decide still that really we're looking for those foods that are a meaningful source of protein, and registered dietitians can jump in on this. We do at the same time emphasize throughout a lot of our materials that yes, small amounts of protein can be gained throughout the day from eating a very wide variety of plant-based foods, not only plant-based proteins like nuts and legumes, but in terms of really those sizable contributions of protein, and being able to meaningfully think about displacement. So if we're shifting our red meat, is that truly replacing arugula? I don't know, but it really, is arugula really replacing red meat? Maybe not, but lentils perhaps likely would be. So that's really been most of the driver of the decision, is that this phase is about the total protein portfolio and shifting emphasis as opposed to the entire diet composition. So that's the main thing I can say at this point, and it sort of relates as well to just kind of the broader taking the step back here is to remember, this is just our first phase. We've started with protein for all of the reasons environmentally that have been mentioned, not to mention what we know in terms of chronic disease burden from red meat in particular. But, you saw in Rich's, one of his slides, I mean, it was pretty interesting, I thought, to see, sugar at the very top has like no environmental impact, but that doesn't mean that we should be upping the sugar purchasing, right? So anyway, that, not to say that that's what would happen with vegetables, but it's really just a way of saying that this is not tracking all purchases.
And real quick, the way because we wrestled with this a little bit with the Cool Food Pledge, we've gotten this question also, and where we netted out on it was if you want to track fruits and vegetables or everything, because some people want to track sugars, or added sugars going up or down, then it's optional. Like, go ahead and track it, especially if you've got your whole spreadsheet going with the the mandatory proteins. If what you want to do is hit 50% fruits and vegetables, then you'll probably want to track that, but that's, it's optional. So maybe that might be a solution for, for MCURC members as well.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that, we would love to hear from all of you about what either, should or could be the next phase or evolved. I think we really want to ensure that we have invested so much in this baseline, so we're not looking to change that starting point, just so we can we can be comparing apples to apples. However, for future phases, and this is where there's so much potential in terms of research, in terms of joint purchasing opportunities that have been discussed, could even be non-food related down the road. If you look at, say, compostable cutlery, or who knows what other elements in terms of just our combined purchasing power. All of that is just, hypothetical future opportunities. But I think I would just urge you to, when you're submitting your data, as you have ideas, to mention those to Jackie. And we really will be looking to hear from all of you about what would be most valuable. And of course, then we think about what about the imprint that has, again, in doing good in the world, and also in, to the point of joint purchasing, to lowering food costs, which is incredibly important part of this. So I think one of the things I think would be great to have, Jackie, if you can just very loosely to speak to, is the opportunities around the health and nutritional elements of this for, down the road. So from my standpoint, one of the things that you can imagine, and what I was trying to get at the beginning of this webinar, saying that right now this is just, this is our first illustration of what we've seen, and trying to give you a little bit of a picture of what's ahead, and again, answer questions that you might have. But we are far from having told our collective story with this, and one of the many stories will also be around longevity, diet quality, the nutritional elements of the diets of your student populations. And Rich, I think maybe that was one of your bullets that was like the phantom bullet that didn't make it onto the slide. So there is a lot more, or there are many layers to this story that will be unfolding over the coming years. And just wanted to make sure that you all know that we're thinking about those. And again, as you have ideas, would love to hear from you what ways can we look at this data, because once we have it, there's so much rich meaning to extract.
To the nutrition point, Sophie, one of the Better Buying Lab members that we worked with when we sort of tested out this type of data collection, went ahead and did a nutritional analysis afterwards, because they had a few quarters of purchasing data, and it was really interesting to see sort of the projected nutritional outcomes going up as the environmental impact was going down. So it's pretty powerful when you are able to combine it, and the hard part is collecting the data, and then there's lots of different ways you can slice and dice it.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, I think the Eat Lancet report that came out offers a really great guideline or guidance towards how we might be able to think about this, both from the environmental perspective and the nutritional perspectives. I would say analyzing nutritional outcomes is not as clear-cut as what Rich has done from the environmental perspective. And so I think there's an opportunity to be creative in how we think about slicing and dicing this data to really measure the impact it's making from a dietary perspective and our nutrition and wellness of our students.
Right, and my head was in the exact same place in terms of the Eat Lancet report, which is that if you look at it, it's really just the the potential of these shifted diets for the future. So it's in addition to, you know, emissions that can be avoided. There's also premature deaths that can be avoided. There's also quality of life that can be improved and things like that. Disease, you know, incidence rates that are curbed and things like that. That we can't say, for you, student A, you will never get, you know, type 2 diabetes, but we can look at that potential from a health standpoint as well is really the opportunity there. And I think that the Eat Lancet report, for those of you who haven't taken a look at it yet, definitely starts to give you some of those numbers that are, you know, in the millions of people. And it's quite staggering, alongside that dual picture of the emissions saved, the water saved, and so on. 4 minutes remaining. Do we have any last questions? I have one other, if not.
Actually, I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is Torrin Monroe from the University of Washington. I do purchasing and projects for our department. And so I guess not just the protein piece, but greenhouse emissions in general. Is there any sort of graphic I could share with my team to show them the impact of how our menus are put together, so I can try and help some of that change? And then B, is there any thought about looking at other ingredients or transport costs in the future? So for instance, if we have specialty products that are coming from another country because customers seem to enjoy the mineral water from Italy as opposed to Saratoga Springs, the transport emissions from that add up. Similar to, you know, getting your lamb from New Zealand or specialty spices from Asia. Is there a way is there any sort of data out there that I could use to display that to my team, to show them the impact that, you know, this one ingredient that we made an exception for really does add up?
Super interesting questions on both fronts. I'd love to let Rich take a stab at that.
I could take a stab at the second part on the transport. So we haven't included it in our calculations yet, just because, I mean, a couple stats to throw out there. At the global level, agricultural, food-related emissions, 80% of those emissions are from agricultural production and land use change, and only 6% are from transport. And then there's a small percent from processing and, you know, other pieces of the food chain. In the US, that number is a little bit higher. I think it's like 11% of emissions, food-related emissions, are from transport. But it's really about it's the type of transport and the distance. And it sounds like you've gone into this some already, but I mean, the rule of thumb for me is always, you know, avoid or minimize the air freighted produce and seafood. But if it's traveling by truck, or if it's traveling by train, or if it's traveling by ship, those emissions are probably going to be really low. But I'm happy to share the resources I have on transport related emissions, if that's something that you'd want to add in yourself. And we could think about maybe adding some, you know, some default factors into a calculator. It's probably not going to move the numbers that much.
No, I really appreciate that. I didn't realize the 6% was that much lower. So, and it definitely helps with the focus being part of sticking to the proteins.
Yeah, but I do like just imagining, you know, the other future potentials, like you mentioned, you know, if it's local and regional sourcing I mean, and you could even just look at other impacts. You could look at economic benefits, right? You could look at a whole range of things beyond just the transportation offsets and things like that. So that's exactly the kind of ideas that we'd love to hear. Well, go ahead, Rich.
I was just going to say too, the first question on graphics, we have a lot of graphics on shifting diets, food, and sustainability that I'd be happy to share. It sounded like you might be looking for something a little bit more tailored to your menu. I'm not sure, but we definitely have some general infographics and stuff that we could share.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, Rich, because I think that would be a perfect thing for Dara, for if you could circulate. There's the one, it's I think a dozen. You had a blog post recently. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's like a dozen graphics. It's so juicy, but it's water, land use, and it really can give you all the ammo you need, for lack of a better term, in terms of being persuasive for shifting towards not only better protein purchases, but a range of types of purchases, I would say. So looking at the clock, we're at the top of the hour. Really appreciate everyone's time today. It was fantastic to see so many people join. Thank you again. Huge thanks to Jackie and Rich for all your work on this. Thank you to Dara behind the scenes making all of this possible. And we look forward to hopefully seeing all of you on our next webinar. Stay tuned for the big reveal on what that will be about. But have a wonderful rest of your day and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.